And it's kind of been a little bit of everything. Like being in DC kind of affords you a lot of opportunities as far as coverage. So I mean, I'm happy to talk about my work. I've covered, like the set right now, like it's figured easy to consolidate my work covering conflict here as opposed to like trying to grab all these articles that I, periodically show up in. But yeah, I've been covering quite a bit this year, everything ranging from the riots up through, reopening protests in Pennsylvania. So like truly across the spectrum of existence.
It looks to me, Amanda, like in your work, you've been able to get very kind of really insider looks at what's going on at these protests. You're very close to these protesters and sometimes what looks like precarious situations. I wonder, how do you build that trust? What do you do to get into their world the way that you do?
I think for me, a big part of it comes from, I try to be very conscientious of the way I approach things. Like I try and think about like, as a journalist, it's really not my job to be pushing any single narrative. However, it is my job to show truly the who of any like 5W story. And that for me is like giving people the time and space to be a person with me as opposed to me pigeonholing them. I mean, some of my work, like I think even covering the riots, like I have like these really tight shots of like people reacting and crying, in addition to like the bigger ones of like the Capitol and people rioting. And a lot of it just comes from like me being physical in their space and actually talking to them. I think for me, like that's imperative as a storyteller. Like you don't serve anything at all, and you definitely don't serve like the purpose of journalism, I think broadly, if you try and keep pigeonholing people into one hole, honestly. Like I really think it's something that is not thoughtful when you just show up knowing what to expect and expecting to like that group is that group and that's that group. You need to be personal. I think what helps for me personally is like I
Is it
am
kind of like, are you saying you kind of need to understand that there is a lot of dimensionality to their
yeah,
humanity?
but also it's not even that. I also just really think it's like, whether or not you're in a group, you also have the rest of your life. Like you are a person, like first and foremost. And my job is to connect with them as a person, whether or not they like me, which they frequently don't, which is kind of a hazard of the job. But other than that, honestly, I think the reason I'm able to get so close is just because like I'm really, really conscientious about my safety. And it's enormously hazardous. Like, I mean, I covered the riots and I took 4 rubber bullets to the leg because I was very, very close to the barricades. I'm actually like, I still have bruises from it now several months on. And yeah, I mean, for me, it's like, I feel like that's my job to be that close to both the people and the situation. But in that also comes the responsibility just to be like the safest I can be, which we'll probably talk about later.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that. Next, I'm going to share Ethan Rocke's, hang on a second, let me get my share screen up here. Ethan Rocke's video, and maybe I'll have, hang on, let me do another share screen here. Here we go. Just because our stuff is short, I might speed through this a little bit. So no offense, Ethan, but I'm just gonna play it out now and just see how we do. And hopefully, let me know if you can hear audio from this. I think you should be able to. Are you able to hear music right now?
No.
Nope, hang on a second. There we go. How about now?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So the bulk of the protests were gathered right here, right behind me. And it ranged from very peaceful and festive, kind of the atmosphere it is now, but with more chanting, all the way to just really ugly.
1 minute. We don't don't want nobody coming here to hijack what we're trying to get through. We don't want the president, we don't want the media, we want whatever our message is, we don't want nobody coming to try to hijack it. No cameras. I'm talking to you, sir, right in front of you. Like, can I get a thumbs up, thumbs down?
Put it away. Put it away.
Can you stop touching my camera?
Put it away. We're asking you to put it away. It was a democratic decision. I don't care. It was a democratic decision. Put that shit away.
In the intersection behind me, there was actually a row of dumpsters, and we didn't know this, but protesters had taken bike locks and chained them all together, so it was just a daisy chain of dumpsters. We never had to lay hands on anybody. We cleared the dumpsters out of the way, muscled them completely, secured.
I think you're muted, Russell.
Ethan, was this a multimedia project? Can you describe what the deliverable was on this content you have?
Yeah, we try. Anytime we put a report on site anywhere, it's usually we're going for like a full multimedia treatment. The Intel summaries are kind of like one of our video products on our YouTube channel, and it's usually just like it sounds. It's kind of as succinct a video summary as we can get. Usually subtitle like that, or title slides like that at the bottom, kind of often summarizing what you're seeing. But I also produced several articles, like some just general news articles right after my coverage, and also like I think the biggest piece, and the piece that I think was that I'm most proud of, and I think was the most valuable from a journalistic point of view, was wrote a pretty detailed deep dive essay with photos accompanying it. And it was a kind of a first person reportage essay, I guess, or you could call it. And I tried to just describe as much of what I saw in that weekend I spent in the Chaz or the Chop, with as little with as little commentary or editorialization as possible.
I'll tell you, Ethan, I actually I wrote something about protest coverage for Overseas Press Club, and in it I actually had, I think it's from that same video that you just that I just shared of yours, but I actually had one of the conversations that you had with a protester, and I shared it as an example because I was pretty impressed with the way that you kind of didn't back down when that protester, there's no one right way to handle a protester protesting you. Okay. So I don't want to give the idea that there's one idea of how to do that, but I am interested to hear, what is your reaction when a protester says you can't film here? How do you assert your right to do that? Or do you sometimes not?
Yeah, well, in that case, I did. It was, there's a much more detail in the essay. That's like real dialogue. In that kind of scene. So there's a little bit more context and depth about the exchange, and so it's basically like I get kind of mobbed by several people, and they're all saying different things. Like put it away, and they're trying to make arguments for, like, one of them was like, if he was a good journalist, he would acquiesce and bow down and turn off the camera, and it's like, to me, that's like the opposite is true, because the job of the Fourth Estate is to shine a light wherever people don't want a light shown, especially those in power. Now, obviously, you could argue that this is a little different, but I think that it's important to report thoroughly. And anytime someone is trying to prevent reporting or photos or imagery or video like that, it's oftentimes they have something to hide. And I kind of wrote about that a little bit. So I guess the answer is, while keeping safety in mind, do your best to resist that push to silence you. And that's kind of how I handled it. I was like, hey, I'm just trying to do my job as a journalist. And ultimately, though,
let me follow up you though. How do you keep safety in mind? Are those protests? Is there a threat to your safety, do you think?
I didn't feel in that instance, I didn't feel anyone was getting ready to attack me or anything, especially having been there. It was interesting because I almost left after one day, right? We went there and like day one was like, and I write about in the essay, day one was like Burning Man, peace, love, like hippie vibe, it was like very, like we were all kind of like, wow, this is not what I was expecting. Cause I brought, a veteran friend of mine kind of just to watch my back, I was like, I don't know what I'm getting into and that kind of thing. And, all of us were like, okay, I don't feel unsafe at all. This is a very welcoming environment. The next day was different, and that incident was kind of like the culmination, I guess, of the hostility toward transparency. And so I didn't, I wasn't afraid that somebody was going to attack me in that moment, but I pushed back, to the extent that I felt was important and I could. And then I said, okay, and I'm going to go now because you guys are literally mobbing and menacing me. And I kind of just circled around and got away for a second and came back. And when I came back, my buddy was like, oh yeah, somebody spoke up for transparency, so you can record. That apparently wasn't true, because when I brought a camera up again, this guy who was like one of the security folks, he grabbed his mic from whoever was talking, pointed me out to the crowd and said, this Richard Spencer looking motherfucker over here, who he told not to film is back at it or something. And then it was like same thing, like all eyes on me, mob's like not cool, bro, this is our space, and at that point I was like, all right, like I got as much reporting as I need to tell what I feel is a comprehensive and fair story.
Well, it's interesting, I'll say, and I'll need to move on in a second, but I will say it's interesting that a lot of times these protesters do work against their own interests by cutting out the media, and I mean that from protests of all directions. I always feel like you have a lot more to gain if you have a good, if you're not ashamed of what you're preaching, so to speak, as a protester, you have more to gain by being transparent. But maybe that's not always true, and let me use that segue into Stephen here. I actually met Stephen in the field while we we're both working for different outlets covering the same story. And are you able to see the screen right now?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So Stephen, I'm just going to scroll through these images that you have for us, and maybe you can just talk a little bit about your experience and your background.
Sure. I am based in New York. I grew up in New York, and I didn't really start out wanting to be a journalist, but I really loved photography. And I went to college thinking I was going to be a writer, but I ended up being a photographer. And I love being outside. I love meeting people. I love getting, people talk about the camera as like a passport. You get to use it to go places and to meet people and to see things. And I work mostly in day-to-day news. I primarily shoot for the New York Post, but I have done little stints with the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times and Bloomberg and some of those guys. But once a year, I try to go and do like one big project or something, try to get out of New York just to like refresh my brain creatively, get to experience something different. So I spent some time out covering Standing Rock in North Dakota one year. I went to Hong Kong and covered the protests there, and some various domestic.
Let me ask you, having that international experience working in Hong Kong, can you talk about some of the differences between reporting overseas in a place like Hong Kong versus America?
Well, Hong Kong was really fascinating. One, because Hong Kong is such a cool city. It's like just such a futuristic kind of steampunk, Blade Runner-y type place. Personally, it's very odd because I am half Chinese, half Korean, but I don't speak the language. And so in some ways I could blend in much better. I could, I looked like everyone, but as soon as they started to tell me something or yell at me or, you know, engage with me, I would give them this blank look, and all of a sudden I'd be outed. But, you know, Hong Kong was a really safe place to cover a protest in a lot of ways, just because it, you know, it has the rule of law, at least currently. There are hospitals, you know, nearby. There's a somewhat reputable police force. You know, it used to be the most reputable police force. Now it's sort of under question. But, you know, I knew going into that urban situation that I would have resources, and then, you know, I could like go back to the hotel at the end of the day and take a shower. And after I got pepper sprayed, you know, there was a little more safety built into that scenario. I just love that city too. It was a great opportunity to go to that city, and like, you know, it's truly a 24-hour city. So you can like go on a Tuesday at 4 a.m. and get a bowl of noodles, and there's like someone sitting there reading a newspaper. You know, like they talk about New York being 24 hours. It's a joke. Like New York is closed by like 10, unless you want to like be at a bar, you know, like.
What are some, you know, are there some ways that you have trained, you know, like with either formally or informally, to, you know, to stay safe during coverage of protests, whether here or abroad?
I took 2 classes. I took one at Columbia University. This it's called the DART Center, Reporting in Crisis Zones. And I took the Reuters in-house security class, which was like both of them were like 3 days or something. And they were very interesting for different reasons. So the Reuters one was taught by a former military, I think he was a British special forces guy. And the DART Center was taught by journalists, basically, former war correspondents. And so they were both very useful for different reasons. You know, the military background one was more about like, how do you survive in really terrible conditions? What are things to know about? Like, I still remember some of the weird little things, like when you're entering into a flooded area, you have to remember where the manholes are, because the manhole covers will get popped up, and then you could just, you know, end up falling through one without knowing. And you know, whereas the journalist one was more about like cultivating sources, you know, how to protect data, you know, like how do you travel across country lines and state lines while, you know, securing your data, and a little bit more in depth on like personal experiences of these war correspondents, and like, you know, what worked for them and what didn't work for them. And those anecdotes were really just gold, in my opinion, because it was really cool just hearing about like, you know, the times where you were in danger and how you got out of it, but also like things that you've learned from experience. And on the whole, I think I've learned from just doing it, trying it, and then making mistakes, and then trying to do it better next time. I'm a full believer in just like shooting as much as possible, like, you know, writing as much as possible, just going out there and doing it. And, you know, I think that was the best school for me.
You know, on that, I want to come to you, Amanda, because you spoke earlier, and I wanted to save this story for a little bit later, and maybe now's the time. But you mentioned that you took a couple of rubber bullets at the Capitol riots. I just want to ask you, in your experience covering protests, have you experienced threats from police before? And have you experienced threats from protesters? And what have you done to examine those and mitigate them?
There you go. Yes. Yes, I have definitely I've experienced both. I will say, honestly, at least in DC, I found the police were a lot more aggressive during the Black Lives Matter movement this summer. I found it vastly different, actually. Throughout the course of my reporting this summer, I actually wound up upgrading my personal safety gear because I was hit with tear gas and pepper spray pretty repeatedly and directly. And honestly, I think that's not especially new, but I mean, I've been like physically yanked from situations, and I've been shot out in the feet with like rock salt pretty frequently. And I mean, like, yeah, I've been harassed by protesters like that. Like, I've definitely been told like, oh, you can't photograph here. But I mean, the important thing to remember about photojournalism is like, you don't need to stay engaged that whole time. What I find to be the best course of action for me is like, I get in really close and then get my shot. But then like I will back off, especially if there is protestation. And I mean, like I'm there to report, but I mean, there are many ways to tackle a problem. You don't need to sit, like I can stand my ground, but if there's another way to tackle capturing that same thing, then I will approach it from another situation. And also like I think a lot of it comes down to that personal side. I mean, I covered a lot of like the looting that happened also like, at night, and I can tell you firsthand that like by and large protesters did not want it to happen. And then once like adults left, there's a lot of teenagers who were doing this. And then, like they would try and block me, and like that's fine. I can stand there, but like it's really important to know which battles you're gonna pick. And for me, like I find someone, batting my camera away and telling me no far different from what I have covered when I'm covering things like I covered the Million MAGA March in addition to January 6th, and that was different. I mean, honestly, for me, a man got in my face at January 6th, and he says, "I'm coming back for you tomorrow, and I'm coming with a gun." And on top of that, I mean, this is going to sound so crazy, but this is the first time in my career at the January 6th riots, I've been told by an editor to hide my press credential. Generally, that's something that's not ethically, I never lie about being a photojournalist. I'm proud of what I do, and it's also unethical for me to do so. But I didn't have a press credential on until I put on a gas mask. And I swear to God, it sounds so stupid in hindsight. My thought was that I'll put on my press credential in case I need to get into the Capitol to take shelter. Because I had no idea the scope of what was happening inside. Like being a journalist and a skeptical person, I really didn't. I heard people were breaking in it, but I didn't know the scope until like much later, and then I saw it with my own eyes. And I had people grabbing and taking photos of my credential, which has my face and my name on it. Which is like, it's scary. It's also like very physical, like they're grabbing a hold of you. But at the same time though, it's like, I'm never shy about the fact that I'm a journalist. And I'm also like, the beauty of being a freelancer is that in some situation, it would behoove me to say like, oh, I'm just a freelancer, which is true. As opposed to like someone like Erin Schaff, who's a New York Times photographer, who's also covering the 6th. And once someone found out she was from the New York Times, they physically assaulted her, and she had to go hide in a closet because they stole her camera. So for me, like I'm far more willing to be a little more closed about who I am working for, if not my actual purpose. And honestly, for me, like the best way to mitigate risk in that situation is, again, like pick my battles. There's a certain time and a place to stand your ground, but there's also like, don't forget, like that's not the only way to do it by and large. Like if the situation is so untenable for you in any given spot, like move back 10 feet, because other people will forget about you. As a photojournalist in particular, I think it's kind of your job to like shut up and be invisible sometimes. And so like that's what you should be doing. Shut up, back off 10 feet, people forget you're there, and then circle back. Like it's fine. Your job is to be personable, but also blend. Like the best thing you can do as a journalist is learn how to smile, nod, and say, interesting. Be the thing that people project you onto. Like, don't lie about your purpose, but there's no reason to pick a fight with someone, Here, you're muted.
I've experienced that as well, where there have been times where I felt like, oh, I don't want to be up front right now. It's literally like I know that I'm compromising how these people are going to see me once they recognize that I'm a journalist. And then there's this thing that you have to do, which is that you have to be a good journalist and you have to be honest, I think.
Yeah, it is actually written in the NPPA Code of Ethics. Like you have to be honest about the fact that you're a journalist. Not everyone follows that, but frankly, like I think it's malpractice if you don't. Like people have a right to, they're in a public space. Like you have the right to photograph there and to be there. And if they don't like it, like tough shit. Sorry, excuse my language. But at the same time, though, it's like, people have, I think, the right to deal with that, how they're going to deal with it. And like lying about it and being like, oh no, I'm just a hobbyist. Like that's not ethical.
Well, there is also a question about, I mean, because of the democratization of media over the last 15 years, and there's also a question about just what is a journalist now, which is a different thing. I wonder, Ethan, if you might want to give us your insights on this, because I think that I think that, well, put it this way: the Committee to Protect Journalists describes a journalist as a person who's doing an act of journalism, and that's a very, very broad definition, for sure. It doesn't necessarily mean that they work for the Post or the Times or whatever. But do you think about that question, Ethan? Do you ever is that something that rolls around in your head?
Oh yeah, 100%. Thought about this. I've thought about this a lot, and I can kind of speak to some recent examples of why it's such a kind of moving target, and a really kind of difficult thing to nail down, I think, legally and ethically. So on the one hand, and there's been pushes in the past from Congress, members of Congress and people to push this idea that of some kind of federal credentialing, some kind of authoritative body has to bless you as a journalist in order to be legally protected by shield laws, for example, right? I don't know how many states, if any, I believe some states have shield laws, but they're certainly not, as to my knowledge, a federal shield law. But there's been, this has been a debate for years, right? The idea that, if we're going to have shield laws, then we got to have we got to determine who gets the protection, right? I tend to, my personal ethics, I tend to fall on the if you're doing an act of journalism, you're a journalist. However, right, then there's kind of on the other side of things that can be abused as well. And I think that I've seen, I can't say that I've seen it personally, but I have friends a friend of mine, a good friend of mine who's a photojournalist and was working for an outlet. And I'd like to keep it vague here because, it's his story and his experience and the outlets that he worked for and everything. But what he described to me was, a couple times that he got assaulted while covering the protests in Portland by protesters. Well, I should say the first time it was definitely by protesters. The second time, they may or may not have been protesters, just kind of adjacent to. But I called him because I saw his coverage and I was like, man, I'm so surprised that you have so many photos of the the incidents that have been written about a lot, like people actually trying to commit violent acts, burn down the federal building, throw pipe bombs in the federal building, cut down the barricades, things like that. I was like, I can't believe that you got these images, man. I haven't seen anybody else with these images, how do you do it? And he's like, well, just persistent access over a couple of weeks. And at one point I had to get my ass kicked. And I was like, what happened? And he described being physically assaulted, while he was trying to document one of these incidents. And the person who assaulted him was a big guy who was wearing, was, all dressed in all black, and kind of kitted up as they often are. And he had this it's like this independent, journalism organization badge or whatever. It's basically if you spend enough time down there, you kind of know that's kind of like the Antifa press corps, so to speak. And that's a crude term, right? I don't want to get in hot water, but it's kind of in a way, yes, these guys are live streaming for transparency's sake, but they're also kind of using that affiliation or that badge to kind of you can't touch me kind of thing, or I'm a journalist. So, but they're not impartial, right? They're both protester and journalist. And by no means am I saying you can't be that. But when you start assaulting other journalists, I have some serious problems with, your fidelity to this idea of transparency and truth, right? And so yeah, I think it's the long and short of my answer is that it's a really tough question. It's a really tough issue to kind of nail down. I don't think that I don't think the government should get to decide who is or isn't a journalist and should be protected by shield laws, for example. But I also think that there are kind of some bad actors who use the label and the press credential of journalists to kind of as kind of a cover. So I don't know. Did that answer your question?
I don't know if it's an answerable question, but it was nice to hear you pontificate about it.
All right, fair enough.
Okay, I just want to take a brief pause here now that we're about a half hour into this and we've got about a half hour left. And we will be able to take some questions eventually from people who are listening in. And Jen, is there a process? Should they text you if they have a question, or what should they do?
You can put them in the chat and I will gather them and make sure that we answer them or attempt to answer them.
Okay,
Is that
great.
okay?
So for the next couple minutes here, I want to come to Stephen and talk a little bit about your experience with diversity within journalism, both covering, especially when it comes to covering protests. And, you mentioned how, when you were in Hong Kong, you felt like you didn't stand out as much. And then when it came time to speak the language, you did stand out. But I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experiences. And I just want to also cue folks, if you guys have questions for our panelists, Amanda Andrade-Rhoades or Ethan Rocke or Stephen Yang or me, or just have general questions, you can start typing them into the chat. And toward the end, we're going to try and get to as many of those as we can. So go ahead, Stephen, can you talk about, first of all, is there diversity in journalism? Is that a thing?
I mean, I'd say overall, journalism is probably mostly white, generally speaking. Not, there are a decent amount of Asian people, Black people, Hispanic people, but it is like a problem within journalism, I think, that it is not very diverse. And the other element about it is not just race, but I think class and like background. And, I think for me, like I've seen people who come from a completely different background from me have access to a certain type of person. Say they, I have this guy who's like a working class guy from Pennsylvania. He knows how to talk to like another like kind of working class guy in a way that I like, maybe don't know how to do. And that's really valuable. And I think like any kind of group of people, you want to have that diversity. You want to have diversity of age, you want to have diversity of race, you want to have diversity of experience, of class, gender, everything, because it just gives you a certain advantage sometimes, and you don't really know when that is going to come into play. I personally actually feel like I have an advantage being Asian because there isn't a lot of beef with other, social groups, except for maybe other Asians, like when I'm in America, I can go into a neighborhood and I don't look necessarily like a gentrifier. I don't necessarily look like a banker or a lawyer, whatever, and like most, I get these funny looks, like where I'll walk into neighborhood where I clearly don't belong. And then, people kind of look at me like, what's that guy doing here? And then they're like, forget it. Like they just don't want to deal with it, like, well, we like his food. His food is okay, like that kind of stuff and it's kind of an icebreaker. Like I've had people, I covered my first foray into like photojournalism was trying to go to Cairo to cover the protests in Cairo. And I had people just coming up to me being like, what are you doing here? And that was such a great like icebreaker for me to then start talking to them and to learn about them and to learn about like what was going on and whatnot. And to have people approach me with questions was invaluable. So yeah, there's been great things about sticking out.
But I just want to ask, because you've been to so many places that you've done reporting. I've seen you I've seen you in the field suited up. You bring 2 cameras, right? Did you have yeah. So you do stand out a bit, but I wonder about all these different things. Have you had different experiences related to how you cover the government, how something's happening with the government, and do you have any thoughts about whether let's say you're covering something at the mayor's office or something like that? What are your thoughts on the ethical conundrums of covering kind of an access event, so to speak, and do they differ across different places?
So someone told me, I had this conversation with a longtime reporter years ago, and what she said was really interesting. She said, it's not about being objective all the time. I think objectivity is important, but it's kind of, we harp on that too much. It's about being fair. and it's about trying to put pressure on someone who has the power to destroy you, the same pressure that you would put on someone who has no power whatsoever, and trying to I've had a hard time wrapping my head around that over the years, because I do feel like we play into it as journalists. Like, we'll accept an invitation to the White House or to the governor's office or whatever it is, and we're essentially repeating what they want us to repeat. And it's not to say we can't be critical of it, but we are agreeing access in exchange for information. Whereas then, if they send us on like a homeless story or something, we're in a position of power, and we can wield it over the person. They have no defense, they can't hide, they can't run to their apartment, and there is a bit of inequity. And I think it is the job of the journalist to try to be conscious of that, and to try to not buy what is being sold to us, but also to not wield our power over people who have no power just because we can. And I think Amanda touched on that a bit, and Ethan as well. I mean, it really is like, there isn't always one way to do it, but I think as a journalist, you have to go into these situations with questions, and questioning your own tactics too, and our own biases and our own preconceptions and whatnot. And that's just a constant thing, but it does bother me sometimes that we go into City Hall and we're expected to be grateful for the access. And then we're supposed to use then that gratitude in order to tell this story, that they want us to tell for whatever reason. Sometimes it's nefarious, sometimes it's not, but I do feel conflicted, at times playing into that.
I'm just going to put this question out for all three of our panelists. So it was kind of random that I selected you all three for this panel. It's just that it so happens that I admire each of your work, and so I kind of wanted to just hit you up and see what you're up to and what have you. But I just kind of noticed, so both Amanda and Stephen are very much photojournalists, I think. And Ethan, you're working in kind of a multimedia spectrum. I feel like, Ethan, you're a staff photographer, or sorry, you're a staff journalist at Black Rifle Coffee. Is that right?
Coffee or die.
Oh, sorry. Insert random veteran company here. I don't.
Yeah. We do have a little bit of affiliation with Black Rifle Coffee Company, but,
Okay.
but we like to keep a little bit of separation of church and state, so to speak. We are a serious editorial institution, so coffee or die.
I appreciate that.
Here we are.
And I wonder if Amanda or Stephen, if you can just talk a little bit about, it's kind of funny because, I feel like when I told my parents, well, I'm going to leave my staff job and get into, freelance journalism, they were like, "Are you crazy? What are you thinking?" Right? Is there hope for freelancers? Are you guys, are you sitting on the corner with a tin cup, or how's it going? Are you able to get work, and how do you do it?
I'll say for myself. So I actually went freelance when I was laid off from a lifestyle magazine, but the lifestyle magazine I knew what I didn't want to be doing. So I'd already been kind of making my inroads the best as I could at that point. It is tough. It was really tough and scary when the pandemic hit. And then I've completely identified as a photojournalist, but I will occasionally take other photo gigs because they tend to pay a little better. But then that completely dried up with the pandemic. But then last year I made 100% of my income from photojournalism. And honestly, it is tough. And I think it depends on your market. DC is increasingly saturated. There was a point where I was working on the Hill most days of the week, and now I barely do because there is such a large pool all of a sudden. But honestly, it is tough, but if you keep working at it, there is usually a way in, and that may require relocation. I moved to DC after a really crappy reporting job near LA with 4 boxes in my car, and I did not have a job lined up. And I wound up getting that job at the Lifestyle magazine. I did that for 3 years. And so I really think if you really want something, you have to really put in that effort. And honestly, it may not work out, but right now, at least, it is survivable. And I don't know what the future of the industry is going to look like. But I think a lot of newspapers are increasingly realizing like they're following the San Francisco Chronicle model. Like when they were financially on the rocks, they invested in their photo staff, and like they're turning a profit now most quarters. I think people are realizing the importance of visuals. So yeah, I mean, I think I think it's okay. And what's helped me is also like reaching out and like finding other photojournalists and like, or just like journalists to work with.
So that's an interesting point you bring up, and Stephen, I wonder if you can expand on it, because one benefit I think to being on staff at a place is that you do have a little bit more safety recourse, I think, in my opinion, as far as there's usually a little bit more of a safety protocol in place for those field reporters who are on a staff at a company versus freelancers. Am I right about that, or is that kind of a misconception? And have you ever, experienced being in danger during protest coverage as a freelancer?
Yeah, I think it really, the first question, I think it depends on where you're a staffer and for what publication. So I belong to a couple of Facebook groups, and they kind of informed me that if you're in a smaller town as a staffer, you actually don't have a lot of support and the salaries are quite low. So it's pretty different than being staff in a big city for a big paper or something. So I don't know, I've never been staff anywhere, so I can't really weigh in on that experience. But as a freelancer, I've been remarkably lucky. I've covered a lot of, aside from the protests, I used to cover a lot of day-to-day crime and fires, shootings, stabbings, that kind of stuff. And in some ways that was a little bit more scary because you're kind of just out on your own in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. or something with a bunch of cameras hanging off your neck. Whereas a protest, there's different groups of people and there's often law enforcement and there's someone there. My first real, well, in Egypt, I got dragged away by the Egyptian military and they stole one of my, they wanted my cameras, but they settled for my memory cards. But that's sort of a different story. The first real consequence, I've been like batoned and like pushed to the ground and thrown and that kind of stuff and hit with a rubber bullet. And
this is by police or protesters or both?
Police mostly. I guess I started in New York covering Occupy Wall Street, and so there was definitely a lot of shoving and grabbing and batoning and that kind of stuff. But on the whole, I've like made it out pretty luckily without too much incident. In Hong Kong, I got tear gassed really badly. Like that was the first time I had a gas mask and I used it like continuously. And then one time I just took it off at the wrong time, and then a huge wave came and I got sprayed with that. It was just like blue water that they were spraying at everyone. And that was brutal because it just like, it got all over my body and then it burned continuously for like 36 hours. But during last June rather.
Did that mess up your gear too? That I always looked at that blue water. I've never had the pleasure of that experience.
It actually didn't. I have to say the gear was okay. And for many years, actually, as a freelancer, I had gear insurance, but I didn't have health insurance. So that was sort of the state of my priorities. And last June, I was photographing the looting in New York, and someone came up from behind me and grabbed one of my cameras, and I kind of like tried to pull it back, and then I just saw this fist come straight towards my face and it hit my nose and it was all bloody. And the guy, or I think it was a guy, made off with my camera. And that was maybe the most like acute consequence of doing this job for me. But yeah, I don't know. I think being a freelancer, it's tough. Like, it's a tough life, but like Amanda said, if you really love it, I think that the work doesn't feel like work. In fact, the work feels like when you finally get to do what you really want to be doing. But the finances of it are real. And it's something that I've struggled with personally for many years. I had a bit of a like momentum going kind of around Standing Rock. I was shooting for Getty and Reuters, and my work was being distributed onto these like big publications. And I used that as an opportunity to meet with all these different publications, and I got some calls, like from the Times and from the Wires and that kind of stuff, but it just wasn't enough work for me personally to make it work financially, but also like psychologically. Like I'm just, maybe that's just my personality. Like I want to be working all the time, you know? And so when the New York Post, which is not the most esteemed publication by any stretch, you know, like started giving me just like regular work, you know, 4 or 5 days a week for an entire year or 2 years, or I mean, now it's sort of like 6 or 7 years of basically full-time work. It was really hard for me to turn that down, you know, like I could buy gear, I could have a life,
Sure,
you know, I could,
yeah.
you know, and so that really affected my decision, honestly.
I want to mention, since we're talking about safety, and we've twice talked about some encounters with looting. Just for me, as a personal choice that I've made over the last few years, as well, particularly after the George Floyd protests, I was looting. I was looting. I was filming
Nice.
looting. You feel like it. You feel like it because you get the same kind of weird energy when you're filming a crime. I think the same kind of, you know, nervousness that runs through you. You know. But so I was filming looting, and I was not attacked, and I was at a pretty safe distance. But it did occur to me in that moment. It was like, because I was in where I was in the Bronx. I was in the Bronx, and there were police nearby the looting, and the police were not engaging with the looters, and they were just kind of letting them do their thing. And I realized, like, oh my God, these guys run these streets right now. And I am a huge target sitting out here with, no kidding, a $25,000 camera, right? And just, you know, nobody to. I had one person like watching my back, but what was he gonna do if I was attacked by? And the other thing about looting is you have to remember you're filming a crime, which means, one, your footage is evidence that people are pretty aware of that. Criminals are pretty savvy about the fact that they don't want to be, well, not always, but sometimes they're pretty savvy about not wanting to be filmed while committing a crime. And two, your footage can actually be taken by police because now it's evidence in a crime, which could also be, I mean, I'm pretty sensitive to the possibility of government censorship, but that's one of the times when they can take your stuff. So I've actually since then made a policy of I just don't film looting. I really don't. And I've also found a lot of these stores have security cameras, and they tend to be more than happy to share that footage, which is usually better than anything I could have got anyway. And for me, that's one example of how I try to mitigate risks when covering protest or riot events. I want to shut up now and give the floor over to some of our chatters. And since we have a pretty small crowd right now, maybe we can actually, if you put on your video, you can actually, you know, ask your question. I'll let Jen kind of guide that. Go ahead, Jen.
Okay, one of them, it's talking about certain recommendations for insurance and different kinds of legal support if you do get, you know, detained. Do you have any kind of recommendations? We have several questions too, by the way.
I definitely do. I use Great American Insurance. I had a camera stolen from me on assignment the day after my birthday last year. Great American replaced it pretty quickly, and their premiums are very reasonable. I would also strongly encourage everyone to join NPPA if you're a photographer, National Press Photographer Association. I was in a jam last year when I found out I had an arrest warrant out for me in the state of Virginia, related to my reporting on Liberty University. And I won't say who I was working for, but they chose not to back me up. And I had this, they actually initially said that the warrant didn't exist. And I swear on my life, the editor called me hysterical and overly emotional about it. And like, I was pretty taken aback by that because I literally called them like, hey, like I got this notice with the warrant. And they're like, you're being emotional about this. And it's like, I want to make sure I'm not going to get arrested if I get pulled over for speeding. But their lawyer, Mickey Osterricker with MPPA, he pushed the company to represent me, and my charges have since been dropped and expunged. And he's been enormously helpful, especially as the DOJ has approached me about the death threats that I received. I will say for my part though, like if asked by the police to turn over footage, I would not be willing to do so. Like that's not my job. So, and I haven't been approached. I mean, DOJ asked me in their investigation towards threats of me, and like, A, I didn't have much to offer, and B, it felt ethically like not my job to do so. So.
Okay, awesome. Greg Walker, GW.
Jen, can I chime in real quick?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, I just want to echo an endorsement for the MPPA, right? It's a great organization, institution. It's been around a really long time, and they just do great stuff for journalists and supporting photojournalism and journalists in general. Just so yeah, I just want to say if you join MPPA, it's a great org with a lot of benefits.
I'll third that. I was thinking like, oh, I never used that, and then I was like, oh yeah, I did get out of a legal jam from Mickey.
Mickey is the MVP, I'm telling you.
Yeah, he's great. Totally joined that organization.
Awesome.
And second for Great American.
Yeah, they're great.
All right. This is from Greg regarding who is a journalist and how, as a journalist, you create your own passport. And I'm going back down. The danger of the frontline journalism and how we, as journalists, can protect ourselves, our peers, and in some cases, see justice done when journalists are attacked or even killed. And does anybody have a comment or?
So, can you clarify? I'm not sure what the question is there.
I think it's more of a comment, and I just wanted to make sure. Greg, you're here. Gregory.
Hi. One, it's really delightful to be coming to you from Central Oregon on a beautiful day, wherever you all may be, and to see such encouraged, energized, and committed writers and journalists and photographers out there. I've as Jen and I have known each other for a long time. I've got a very eclectic background, but the base of it is 40 years now as an author, as a journalist, as an editor, as a war correspondent during the Iraq War and the war in El Salvador. So it's more of a comment because the questions and the situations were very reminiscent of what I've seen and others have seen in the past. Number one, I would encourage you to, if you're not following it or don't know anything about it, to do a Google search regarding the 4 Dutch journalists who were assassinated in El Salvador in 1982. That is a war crime. It is a war crime that I've been involved as a journalist and hoping to see the perpetrator of that, who gave the orders for those 4 guys to be killed. Now getting ready to possibly to be deported from the United States, where he came in '86, and be sent back to El Salvador to stand trial for those deaths. As journalists, it's my opinion and it's my experience that we have to take care of each other, and that means that if one of us gets in a jam and gets imprisoned, or gets, as these 4 gentlemen were, gets killed, that depending on who you are and where you are and what your opportunities are, you can make a difference. And when we do that, we send a message that, you kill a journalist, there's a price to be paid, and it may not be paid tomorrow, and it may not be paid the next day.
Greg, I'll second that. I'll say, I mean, I agree with what you said. And here in our own reporting in recent, really in the last year, looking at the press freedom tracker here in America, first of all, it's funny because you described your coverage in war zones and related it to the experiences that we're talking about here. And what's interesting about that is that I think that, overseas experiences that I've had have really helped my reporting on American events as of recently. I mean, we never had insurrections in America before. We never had, well, I'll just say I don't want to sensationalize, but I will say that I think that reporters in America are undergoing kind of a different era right now, where the dangers that we once experienced in overseas reporting are more present in our everyday lives here in America. And it's not just an opinion that I have. I mean, the press freedom tracker shows that there are a lot more journalists that are getting injured by activities while covering work. that they're experiencing silencing and censorship of their work. I know that I've certainly experienced that through some of my interactions with both police and protesters, mostly with police in my experience. And also I do want to throw a little shout out and commend the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is an organization that has followed the case that you're talking about, Greg, as well as, if you're interested in following up with more solidarity between journalists, I would definitely recommend for our viewers here to get involved with the Committee to Protect Journalists.
I would absolutely concur with that, and I would encourage everybody to go to YouTube and YouTube Zembla, Zembla, In Cold Blood. It is a phenomenal documentary that was done last year on the murders of those guys by a Dutch investigative film crew. Just the lessons that I picked up and I've talked with those guys since, and going about their business and who they went and how they protected themselves and how they got the story, how they found the guy that was responsible when nobody else could find him.
We're gonna check it out. I don't want to take up the whole time on it though, because I want to see if we have maybe one more question we can get to before we go. Do we have another one, Jen?
Yeah, we have a couple, but Jasper, why don't you just go ahead and kind of go through it? I mean, you can speak for yourself.
This is Jasper Lowe, everybody. Are you at Columbia still, Jasper? Where are you at right now?
I'm a fact checker at the New Yorker. I've been there for about a year and a half.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Go ahead.
No, it's good to see everybody. I've been following your work, Stephen, through Chris Jones, who I think maybe bumped into all of you at the Capitol.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's been really invigorating, kind of watching your path. And at points I was like, is this out of order or are you actually there? And it turns out you were actually there every single time. And I was like, no shit. Just a little precursor. I get a little frustrated with the kind of like kinetic coverage, combat coverage, because we focus so much on like tactics and gears. But like for me, I live in Clinton Hill, and right at the first weekend that the George Floyd protests happened, I kind of like ran out the door. And I was a runner for the Daily News, and so I thought maybe I could just like call up the editor, just like say what's up, like I'm here. But I experienced this kind of thing watching this kind of like ebb and flow, and the only thing I can describe it to be is like, at first it's like this kind of like really exciting thing where you're like, what the fuck, like the cop just like beat the hell out of this like random dude who got caught, and then like you see someone throw a bottle and like kind of all these things, but eventually it turns into this kind of like it's like troop movements, it's just kind of like flows this way, it flows that way. And like as I was watching like the South China Morning Post coverage, following Hong Kong like for months, it got to a point where I could see that like they were running their video journalists like down to the ground, following these things. And then I started to question like what news value it has in seeing that like they occupied this roadway and then like, moved here. And then it made me think about like war coverage about like, occupying like certain parts of territory. But the difference in protest coverage is that like, for Hong Kong, for example, you kind of occupy the roadway and then everybody went back to work and then they like came back on another day. And so it made me think about like being a journalist covering like Capitol riots is almost like a bad example because like a very kinetic thing happened, right? And then there was like something to report on. But the more kind of like reporting on protests becomes like a kind of like regular beat almost, like, and like, how do you kind of parse out what the story actually is without kind of focusing on like that cool dude over there, like dressed up and kitted out, or like, someone with like a pithy sign, how do you kind of get to the core of that story? And I'm curious because Stephen, like you saw so many of these places and like, especially Amanda, like, you run around DC where all shit keeps happening.
Hey, Stephen, before you answer that, I just want to say, I would really love to also jump in on that question when you get done answering it.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think it's a challenge. And I think that, we do have to, as journalists, be aware that it gets repetitive, and that maybe we're focusing on the same thing over and over and over again. And I mean, Hong Kong was a really funny one because neither the police nor the crowds wanted to flank each other. So they were literally just chasing each other down the street and then chasing each other back. And it was pretty crazy to watch. And there was so much media. I mean, that was probably the most saturated media situation I've ever seen, aside from maybe, I don't know, Standing Rock. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. And like, I personally get tricked into that, I think, of like thinking like, oh, this is more explosive and more interesting, so I'm drawn towards it. And, I think partly it's like trying to find the quieter moments, and that's what I love too about seeing other people's work. Like, what Amanda shot was different than what I shot, and like, and we inform each other and we fill in different pieces. And so part of that burden, I guess, does also lie on the reader and the viewer to kind of seek out other like, news sources or other ways of approaching it. I mean, some of it may not exist, but I find great content elsewhere, on other, like one of my favorite things is This American Life and, The Moth and like public radio, because it just gives such a different take on like a topic that may be in the news, but they'll just approach it in a completely different way. And one of my favorite series of all time is the New York Times 1 in 8 million stories, where they basically just found an interest, just a New Yorker, and they just followed him for a while, or her, and then like did a photo slideshow and an audio recording. And it's such a good reminder that you don't need explosions, you don't need drama, you don't need all that stuff to tell an engaging and informative story. All you need is some patience and intimacy. And so I think, yeah, it's a good point that protest coverage often is like too much engaged with like the baton swinging and all that stuff. And we should look in other ways. And I think there are publications out there doing that kind of stuff. Like I think like Politico and The Intercept and The New Yorker, I mean, you guys are great at doing those kind of like more in-depth looks about stuff. I read like a 25-page essay about pennies one time, and I was like, what? Like, not something I would seek out. But anyways, Ethan, why don't you take over?
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, great insights there. And I'll just say, like, I feel really fortunate to be at Coffee or Die, because we pride ourselves on being a place that greatly values, invests in, and will run long form, right? Or the more, as you put it, in-depth coverage, right? And I think that that's vital in today's media landscape, right? That I mean, because especially with the medium of photojournalism, right? I started as a purely still photojournalist. My career started as a Marine correspondent, as an enlisted Marine, and then when I left the military, completed my degree in photojournalism from Syracuse University, and then went on to study and practice multimedia journalism, right? So I got the video production, the filmmaking side of things. However, I think print, text, and still photos will always be my first love. It's probably what I enjoy the most. But there is, especially with photojournalism, I think that there is both a strength and a weakness to that medium, right? In terms of context and kind of the space in between those images that you've shot and selected, right? And like the parts of the story that frame can't capture, so it's difficult, right? And of course, you mentioned, as freelancers, we're often looking for whoever can hire us, right? And so you're beholden oftentimes as a freelancer to the editorial biases of the outlet that you're working for, that kind of thing. And I think, like, for me personally, I feel really fortunate to be at an outlet. I want to say that there are a lot of folks who have the perception that it's Coffee or Die is that that bro vet outlet, and they're like, they got that like right-wing slant. Like, we don't, right? Like, we pride ourselves.
What I'm curious about is and like I was hoping that we wouldn't go in the route like I wanted Stephen to finish, but like I'm curious about like when you're covering the event is what I mean. I don't mean it on like a theoretical level. Like, I'm a fact checker at the New Yorker. We talk about editorial shit all the time, and like that's not like how the story can be talked about is like a whole other thing that I just like don't really want to pontificate over. And like I'm really curious about like when you're covering these things, and you're there and you feel that like that lag, that like kind of slur where like it's just kind of like, what am I supposed to be looking at right now? And like it's curious because like in Hong Kong context, that's funny. I didn't realize it was so saturated. But in New York, for example, in Mott Haven, you know, the what it ended up being in one of the worst cases of kettling ended up being a class action suit. You know, and like there's a moment where I think a journalist maybe just stuck around and then was like, holy shit, like they're coming in every single corner. They've stopped everyone at every corner. They blocked it off and they're just walking it in. And like, there's a moment where I think as a photojournalist or as a journalist, you would have just, all you had to do was stick around. But like in something where it's like ebbing and flowing, what do you do? You know, like what is your instinct that to follow, you know, in that moment? Because you know, yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off, Ethan. It's just that like I want to know like what we're supposed to do as journalists in that moment.
I mean, I can also talk about this a little bit if you want. I will say for me, I mean, my philosophy is like always show up early and stay late. But also like, I mean, I get it. Like, I think visually this happens to us too. Like if I see another photo of a bunch of raised fists, like it's a very potent image, but I've seen it a million times. And like, I get it. Once you cover like, it's a lot of protests have the same flavor, or like it's a continual story, but that's the thing. I think you have to treat it like a continual story. It's like not X protest this day. It's like, what does this say about the bigger narrative? And for me, what's helpful is I like try not to get bogged, like for the sake of freelancing, I will get the shot that kind of the editors expect, but my job is to like focus on the deeply personal and like the reason why people are there that day. And like it's a really difficult question. Like I don't know that there is a right answer or a single right approach, because I think it's also can like sometimes when things are continuous, it can lead to some lazy reporting, and it's a very reasonable instinct. We're human.
Yeah, I think I just to piggyback off what you're saying there. The real answer is it depends, right? And so I don't think you know there's not an easy answer to that question. You know, and I was trying to talk about the bigger picture in terms of like ethics in general, but you know, apparently we don't want to hear that. So like, I'll just leave it at that.
I guess for me, like my sense is to constantly is you can't go in thinking it's going to be like every other event, every other protest. Like it takes a lot of work to remain that consistently curious, but you have to work at it and continue to be that open to whatever is going to happen. And like, yes, cover your bases as far as like your 5 Ws, but like really like keep working it as a story and not just an event. Like that's my instinct. I don't know if that answers your question, but
I'll add to that. I mean, I think in the mechanics of covering it, if that's what you're after, is for me, I just try not to take the same photo idea over and over and over again. You know, so if I've gotten one guy with like a clever sign, I'm gonna try to not get another guy with a sign. You know, like I think it's just about trying to get to the next thing and move on to the next idea. And that can be hard to remember, I think, in the moment. But, you know, I think people use this phrase like work it. You know, you have to work the scene. You know, you find another angle. You have to use a different lens. You have to find a different vantage point. You have to find a different person, you know, all that stuff. And the more you can work it, the better. I mean, and the longer you can work it, the better. And honestly, like, I don't have that problem in protests. I have that problem when it's like a press conference, you know, and it's like, how many times can you shoot a guy speaking at a microphone and make it look like he's not eating the microphone? You know, like, I don't know, like that to me, those are the challenging times. Like if there's like action and different people doing different things, I love those situations.
Well, I'll say, listen, we're 10 minutes over now. So I think that I want to be respectful of everybody's time and we should start to wrap it up. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists, Amanda Andrade-Rhoades, Ethan Rocke, and Stephen Yang. Look for their work, and thank you all for joining in on this panel and participating with us and talking about protest coverage. And I guess that's it. So thanks to everybody.
Can we do a reverse panel? Because I've got so many questions for all you all too.
Yeah, I do too.
I'm gonna stick around here. I don't have anywhere to go. I just I wanted to at least put kind of a you know, button in there and let you know that we're technically done, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to hang around if anybody wants to keep the conversation going.
So do you guys want me to keep recording it, or what do you want me to do? Should I just call it and then, because this is the webinar, or how do you want me to handle?
I mean, I don't know. I didn't even know we were recording it. but whatever you think is best, Jen. Is there any reason?
I think maybe that I'll just stop it and then let you guys keep going. How does that sound?
Okay, good. Yeah, good. We can. Oh, and I put a nice ender on there, right? We can cut it off there. Is there? Yeah. Fine.
And there's Martin has a comment, and just to let you guys know, I just want to put it. I think that was the last one, but I wanted to make sure he had a chance, since you're going to go a little bit longer, to make his
sure.
comment.
We'll address, what you got, Martin? Are you there, Martin?
Yep.
There you go. Can you hear me?
Hey, Martin.
Hear me now? I actually wanted to say hi to Amanda. Me and you had met on the streets of Black Lives Matter Plaza in DC.
Yeah, say you look familiar. Good to see
I'm
you.
not sure which day it was. I grew up in DC, was living in Southeast for a long time. Now I moved down to North Carolina, but I'm up there all the time. Something I was really amazed with, I'm obviously older than most of you. I've been a photographer for like 40 years, started out in journalism, then had to make a living doing the wedding and the commercial stuff for a long time. And about 10 years ago, I started to get back into the journalism. But something that really has amazed me is how much journalists in general, but photojournalists in particular, have each other's back. I don't know how many times I'm standing there and somebody would bump me and say, hey, let's check this out. Or I'd see some kid who's running to some action who doesn't see the cops car coming at him at 40 miles an hour, and I'd have to grab him. It was really impressive to me that the photographers really kept an eye on each other to keep us out of trouble. And it was nice also. I met a lot of my mentors down in DC. I mean, Amanda, who I didn't know, I'd seen her work in the Washington Post, and we chat and everybody has masks on. You can't really tell who it is. But I met Lindsay Addario. I met Ron Haviv. I met some great people that I've admired the work for a long time. I was just curious, does everybody else have that same feeling now in journalism and photojournalism, that there's a camaraderie on the streets? Of course, we all do things like this, but literally on the streets in the turmoil, you feel like you have each other's back. And I was real impressed by that.
I mean, I think it's good to see you. I was like, hey, I recognize that guy. No, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I really do feel like there's a strong sense of camaraderie, especially in DC, because like realistically, this is a very small industry. Like outside of my little circle of friends, like I am like by and large, like for most of my acquaintances, I am the only photojournalist they know. And I really think you have to be nice to each other, because I mean, this is an industry where it's like you run into the same people over and over again. But I really do think there is a broad sense of camaraderie. I know for me, a safety tactic that I use is like, I use like a geolocation. I typically pair up with another photojournalist, and we will periodically just check on each other when we're at these big kind of events. But also like, you have to kind of look out for each other. Like, it's, everyone is competitive in that we want to get our shot, but at the same time though, like, you're not going to stand by and like let someone get hurt. That's just not the way it works. I've been fortunate enough to like, I've had people who've had my back. Like, I mean, there have definitely been times where it's like, I've had street medics wash out my eyes before. There's a mosquito in my room. And it's, you have to stay connected with other people. And I honestly think it's the best way to survive, because also like, it's a referral based industry by and large. Like a lot of the work that I've gotten, just like even on the financial level, like most of my work is referral based. So yeah, I do find there is a pretty strong community, and like in DC in particular, and like they said at the top, I'm the treasurer of Women Photojournalists of Washington. So photojournalism still remains 85% men. It is the most male dominated section of news, and it's still overwhelmingly white. But increasingly there are groups to kind of like bring people together, and to like, it builds a better network, I think, and that kind of helps everyone out, I think. So, but I don't know how it is in your markets, but I think here it's a pretty solid group.